And welcome, Hoosier fans, to this week's edition of Assembly Call Radio, where each week we discuss the most important IU basketball stories from the past 7 days. This is our 68th edition of Assembly Call Radio, and it is our 395th episode overall of the Assembly Call, recorded on the evening of Wednesday, March 21st, 2018, a day earlier than our usual Thursday night recording times because we did not want to conflict with the first set of Sweet 16 games. Next week, our live broadcast should be back on its usual night. I am your host, Jared Morris, and let's begin this week how we begin every episode of the Assembly Call, and that is with our Hoosier Proud banner moment. And, after watching another NCAA Tournament opening weekend without our Hoosiers and with no significant recruiting news to speak of from the past week, other than Romeo Langford and Demezi Anderson, unfortunately, each falling in their semi-state matchups, there really isn't much from an IU men's basketball perspective to warrant a banner moment. But there are some other IU sports that are rolling, and so I just want to take a quick second to recognize a few of them. Let's start with last week. The women's swimming and diving team finished 8th at the NCAA championships, and as we have come to expect, Olympic champion Lily King was just unbelievably dominant in the 200 breaststroke. She won her third straight NCAA title in the event with the best time in history, period. She is the first woman to break the 2-minute, 3-second barrier, setting the American NCAA meet, U.S. Open, Big Ten, IU school, and pool records with her performance. She is amazing. Lily's 6 NCAA titles are the most for any woman in Big Ten history. And as we are recording this on Wednesday evening, the number 3 ranked IU men's swimming and diving team is in Minneapolis for the 2018 NCAA championships. Indiana is sending a total of 14 swimmers and divers. And along with the individual events, the Hoosiers will also swim in all 5 relays. As you probably know, the Hoosiers have won 6 NCAA championships. They placed 7th last season, their highest finish since 1979, and they will be seeking their first banner since 1973. The IU women's basketball team is facing off against Purdue at Simon Scott Assembly Hall on Thursday evening in the third round of the women's NIT as Tyra Buss, Amanda Cahill, and crew look to continue their march toward an NIT banner. And Indiana swept the season series against the Boilermakers, so hopefully they do it again. And the top 25 Indiana baseball team is off to a solid start with a 15-4 record, winners of 6 straight, entering a weekend series against Iowa. And by the way, if you want to keep up with the baseball Hoosiers, I highly recommend that you check out the show Talking Hoosier Baseball, which is hosted by the coach, Brian Tonsoni, our frequent guest co-host here at the Assembly Call, also the founder of the number 1 ranked Delphi Bracketology Club. Again, that show is called Talking Hoosier Baseball, and you can find it by searching for Brian's podcast feed, Sports Talk with Tonsoni, anywhere that podcasts are found. So in closing, good luck to all the Hoosier athletes out there seeking to add to Indiana's storied athletic history with more impressive individual performances, more incredible team success, and of course, more banners. All right, now let me introduce my esteemed co-hosts for this week's show. To my left, we have one of the top 10 bracketologists in the world and a recovering fan club president who will surely be cheering Robert Johnson on wherever Rojo's professional career takes him, but who is now searching for a new Hoosier to call his own. He is Andy Bottoms. Andy, what is your Bottoms line from the past week in IU basketball or just basketball in general?
I guess I feel like I have to stick with basketball in general since there's not a lot of IU stuff to talk about. Here in Cincinnati, it's the picture of despair between the Cincinnati and Xavier losing. We got snow today, more predicted for the weekend, so the White Death has also descended upon us. And other than that, there's not a lot to get excited about basketball wise for fans of teams here. But I tell you, to be able to be in that position where you're kind of living and dying with how your team is doing in the tournament is something that I think all IU fans would long for after these last couple of seasons of not being in the tournament. So while the tournament can certainly in some ways it's nice to sit back and kind of watch the carnage as somebody who doesn't have a dog in the fight. There's still a part of you that is like, man, I just wish, you could see your team play and see their name called and all those kinds of things. So, hopefully we're a week closer to being able to experience that again and going from there. But, the tournament overall, I think has been an enjoyable one. It's always one of my, favorite events. Don't go to work that Thursday and Friday and just sit back and enjoy some games. And for the most part, things did not disappoint last weekend, and looking forward to another set of good games, this week with still some potential Cinderellas out there, and we'll see what happens, but should be fun to watch.
And to my right, we unfortunately do not have Ryan Phillips, who had a previous engagement and was especially disappointed to have to miss this week's show, given what we're going to discuss. But before I introduce Ryan's replacement host, I hope that you will indulge me in a quick reading of a brief text exchange that he and I had on Monday night, because I think it explains a lot. So here we go. This is me. Random question, but how old are you? Ryan. Too old. 37. I actually threw my back out even typing that. Me. When is your birthday? Heather and I were debating whether you were older or younger than me. I couldn't remember. Ryan. This is verbatim from the text. I wasn't born. I was created by Zeus. Ladies and gentlemen, Ryan Phillips. So now, to my right, he is the godfather of IU basketball podcasters. He runs the sports media program at IU. He is the director of the National Sports Journalism Center. And like Andy and Coach Tonsoni, is a well-regarded amateur bracketologist. He also has very strong opinions about pizza in Bloomington. And we have been fortunate to have him as a frequent contributor on our show many times, and we're happy to have him back this week since the son of Zeus couldn't make it. He is Galen Clavio, the host of Crimson Cast. Galen, as we embark on yet another weekend of NCAA Tournament basketball without the Hoosiers, what is on your mind?
The rapid disappearance of basketball, I'd say, is the thing that's primarily on my mind. Although I guess being born from gods is now on my mind a bit as well. I wasn't really expecting that aspect of things from Ryan of all people, but hey, but no, it's funny when we get to this time of the year, I always get a little bit twingy and nervous because I realize that even though the tournament is great and it's this wonderful banquet of basketball, this weekend means that we're almost done. We've got the Sweet 16, the Elite Eight, the Final Four, and then we're done with college basketball, really, except for some recruiting to clean up until October. And that's very difficult for me to deal with. So I actually broke down and bought a computer game called Draft Day Sports College Basketball, which I'd been flirting with for several years. I played the demo a couple of times, and I've been coaching a virtual team in college basketball. Got San Diego State first season. We're in the CBI, like the regional final right now, which is great. That's kind of satisfying me. I'm like, okay, great. I can keep myself busy through April and May.
Oh, you weren't too good for the CBI. You decided to.
No. Decided that, yeah. And actually, we hosted games too. It was great. The athletic director was on board with it. We were fine with everything. But I did want everybody to know that the Archie Miller led IU basketball team in this game in like 2019, 2020 is ranked 4th in the country. They've had a Final Four appearance in the previous year. So I'm really optimistic now. This is great.
I think we can just wrap the show right there. I think we just hit the high point. Okay, so here are the topics and questions that we're going to address this week. And I know that, there have been some grad transfers announced, and Indiana's kind of sniffing around some of those guys and some junior college guys. We're going to save all that for some later shows once we get a little bit more insight on, where there's mutual interest and how serious that stuff is. So we're not going to address that, even though I know that you all have questions about that. But we're going to address some topics that came up during the opening weekend of the NCAA tournament that kind of had an IU tie-in. And so we're going to quickly, I hope, bust the myth believed by some IU fans that Archie Miller's system is the same as Tony Bennett's system, because it's not. We're also going to bust the myth that the pack line defense sucks against three-pointers, because I have some data that's pretty compelling there. And then, is Archie Miller's system one that we expect to have both regular season success and tournament success? We'll talk about that. And then maybe we'll debate a little bit how we would feel if Indiana were to be, quote unquote, doomed to the fate of a Virginia or an Arizona. And then we've got some questions from you as well. All of that coming here on Assembly Call Radio. Before we hop into those topics, I do want to remind you that even though obviously there aren't any IU basketball games to purchase now and not even any IU football tickets right now, although actually I haven't checked that. Maybe SeatGeek has IU football tickets. But the URL iutickets.shop, when you use that URL, it will take you to SeatGeek. And so you can use it to find IU football tickets if they're there, concert tickets, anything else that you want to go do during the offseason that's a live event. SeatGeek will pretty much have you covered. And that URL, iutickets.shop, is our affiliate URL. And so we actually get a commission when you use that URL and go on to purchase a ticket. So continue to use it in the offseason. Again, it's iutickets.shop. And don't forget that the promo code ASSEMBLY, ASSEMBLY, will get you $20 back after your first purchase. So use the URL, iutickets.shop, and then the promo code ASSEMBLY when you make that first purchase. All right, you are listening to the Assembly Call. I'm Jared Morris. I'm here with Andy Bottoms and our guest co-host for the week, Galen Clavio. So, Galen, let's tease our opening topic by you maybe explaining your tweet from March 17th, because I feel like this really sums it up. Because while I was going back and forth with all kinds of people, I feel like you, in just kind of one simple tweet, kind of summed up what was going on in the aftermath of the Virginia loss to Maryland, Baltimore County. And here was your tweet. Quote, "There are some crushingly dumb takes about Virginia, pack line defense, and IU hoops out there on Twitter right now." What in particular inspired this?
I mean, it was just watching the chatter in the immediate aftermath of the Virginia game, which seemed to be drawing this parallel between Virginia under Tony Bennett, IU under Archie Miller, and the idea that, oh, the systems are the same and that'll never work here at IU. And you know, this idea that somehow we were on some kind of doomed trajectory with IU basketball as a result of, I guess, the pack line defense, even though that really wasn't the reason at all why Virginia lost the game against Maryland, Baltimore County. And, you know, look, I know the IU fan base is starved for success. It's been a long time since there was sustained success, and I've been following right along with everybody. And I get that people, you know, you're prone on Twitter to overreact and things kind of snowball and roll downhill. But I just felt like people went way overboard. And frankly, it was the continuation of a conversational issue that's lasted for quite a while and been, I think, a problem for quite a while in terms of how IU fans and IU skeptics masquerading as IU fans have been analyzing Archie Miller and this first season for the Hoosiers.
Andy, were you involved in all of that when that was going on after the shock of the Virginia loss?
No, I actively avoided it. I would say, I mean, it just to draw that conclusion from one game and from, you know, if you want to argue about Virginia's system, I mean, they were 31-2 and played in the ACC. Like, to say that system isn't successful, and then to watch a team like Syracuse play, you know, incredibly ugly basketball, forcing, you know, a team to shoot 37 threes and play a guy in the middle of a zone who was actively looking to not shoot, basically didn't even look at the basket. And then to say like, oh, somehow they're vindicated in the success that they have in the tournament and by playing ugly, and yet other teams, just because they had, you know, to Galen's point, you know, the pack line is meant to stop dribble penetration, and UMBC was getting basically wherever they wanted off the dribble. And just, you know, a one game sample to say that something can't work just seemed silly. And you know, everything doesn't work right up until it does. And it just seemed like a foolish thing to get into a debate about it, not even to get into the nuance that I think you wanted to talk about later about how similar or dissimilar things with Archie Miller are. It just seemed like, I don't know, just seemed like, you know, hot takes abound to, you know, to make some generalizations based on a you know, one game result in the tournament that a tournament that often breeds, you know, surprise things that happen.
Yeah, and look, I think one of the things it revealed too is maybe a misunderstanding of how Archie Miller wants Indiana to play, and so I think that's what we want to clear up here. So let's go to the next segment. Let's dive into this. So we're gonna bust this myth that IU fans think that Archie Miller's system is the same as Tony Bennett's system. Talk about what Archie Miller's system really is. That is next. Stick with us. Perfect. Okay, that was 1357 for the first segment. Hello to everybody live on YouTube. Awesome to see you all here. Galen, every time we do this opening and I say the number of the show, 395, I feel intimidated because I remember that Crimson Cast is at like 500 and something.
Right. And that's not even counting the episodes that the Egyptian hackers destroyed in 2010.
Oh.
There was an Egyptian hacker phase, and then there was like an Iranian hacker phase. We lost almost two full seasons worth of podcasts to that. So yeah, the 500 number, it's probably closer to 650. But hey, man, who's counting really?
That's a lot of podcasts. So between us, we've done 1,000 shows about Indiana basketball.
Well, some of ours are also about Indiana football. So
that's true.
Those really should count like triple.
Yeah, they should. Yes. Yes, they should. Oh, they should. Okay, so for this segment, I'll kind of lead into it. Andy, I'll go to you first. I mean, obviously we can give, a quick description of the pack line, and they do play a similar system, and I've got some good numbers there. But really, I think the key is talking about the difference offensively, because what's funny about this discussion is kind of the irony of trying to talk about how Archie is different from Tony Bennett, who is one of the best coaches in college basketball. Like, I feel like we should be hoping that he's similar to him, but I get where people get a little frustrated that, maybe that offensive system won't work in the tournament. I always feel weird, trying to make the argument that he's so much different than Tony Bennett, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's one thing I'll drop in on all of this when we get to talking about it is, I mean, it's really way too early to make a lot of judgments, period. I mean, there's certainly are numbers to go off of, but there's a metamorphosis that will take place just by the nature of the programs and the difference. And I mean, the fact that, the jump from Washington State to Virginia is not nearly as much of a jump as the one from Dayton to IU, in my opinion, in terms of what you can do with the program. So.
And the other thing, and we can mention this too, is when you look at, and it's the same thing with Sean at Arizona, the first few seasons look totally different from how they look now.
Sure.
Like now that they've got it rolling, it's totally different. So, all right, we can hop into this.
Yeah, I mean, Tony Bennett's only won at least 29 games for the last 5 years. That must suck.
Towering fraud of a program. Towering fraud of a program. Okay, let's hop in and we'll meander around this and see where we get. Okay, you guys ready?
Yep.
Okay, here we go. You are listening to the Assembly Call. I'm Jared Morris here with Andy Bottoms and our special guest co-host Galen Clavio from Crimson Cast. Don't forget that if you ever have to miss all or part of an episode of Assembly Call Radio, there are two great ways to catch up. You can subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for Assembly Call, or you can join our live Thursday night broadcast or watch the video replays by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Assembly Call. So with this segment, guys, we're going to discuss this comparison that we all saw made between Archie Miller and Tony Bennett, and just the unnecessary panic that was going on after that Virginia loss to UMBC, and people projecting forward with Archie's system and just having all kinds of bad dreams about what was going to happen. But, I thought it was kind of summed up with this tweet from our guy Josh Hosh.0 on Twitter, who said, "I think people hear pack line defense and freak out because they think of Virginia and the slower pace that they play at. I don't think Archie runs the same offense as Virginia." And Andy, I want to go to you with this first, but I think the real crux of this, and what I think everybody needs to understand, is that, yes, Archie runs the pack line defense. That's the same defense that Tony Bennett runs. Tony's father, Dick Bennett, created the defense, and Tony's adopted it. Sean Miller, Archie Miller, they have adopted it. And obviously, it is a very successful defensive system. You just need to look at the defensive rankings and the success at Virginia and Arizona and what coaches have had who have run it defensively to see how good of a system it is. But don't equate that, playing the pack line defense with necessarily having to play at the super slow pace that Virginia plays at, right? Virginia runs a mover blocker offense. They are consistently among the nation's slowest teams. In fact, their average pace, average ranking for Tony Bennett is 339th. That is really low. And when you look at what Archie has done in his 7 seasons as a head coach, his average ranking is 205th, which is much more in line with, say, what Villanova has been like over the last 5 or 6 years. So, Andy, when we look at the comparison between the two, defensively, you hope that comparison runs as far as Archie Miller can take it, because Virginia is outstanding defensively. But for people who are so afraid that, this terribly slow pace isn't going to work, the system that Archie wants to put in offensively is not really much of anything close to what Tony Bennett is doing at Virginia.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. And what people often point to from a tournament perspective is really the pace. And by playing a lower possession game, you increase the amount of variance that you might have and things like that. And that's where, if you want to make an argument that, in the game when, Virginia gets down 12 points and it's like, oh my God, we can't play fast enough to make up this, 12-point deficit without, jacking threes and panicking a little bit. To me, that was based more on, it was based on the tempo at which they would have had to start trying to play to come back in the game. Their defense certainly was not doing them any favors with some of the looks they were allowing. But yeah, I think you said it well, the pack line is the defensive philosophy, but anybody who plays that defense doesn't do the same thing offensively. You'll see the same principles on one end of the floor, but how they choose to handle it on the other is completely different. And so a lot of the thing that contributes, to some of these odd tournament things that happen in a, single elimination tournament are more based on number of possessions and things like that, the variance that comes into play there, as opposed to the other way around.
And Galen, the other thing too about the offensive systems that's interesting is different things are emphasized. So when you look at kind of, and maybe before we talk about this, you and I were talking about something in the break about how maybe we shouldn't be so quick to say exactly what Archie will be, because we have a big sample size of what Tony Bennett's Virginia teams are and what Sean Miller's Arizona teams are and what Jay Wright's Villanova teams are. And all of those coaches went through a struggle at first, many, kind of some ups and downs getting it in. And now you see kind of a consistent profile. Well, Archie's only had one season. So we don't quite know yet exactly what it will look like. So part of this is trying to project from what his teams did at Dayton. But now with the step up to Indiana and recruiting a different level player, it's not, necessarily going to be the case that his teams will play with the same offensive signature that they did at Dayton.
Yeah, I mean, what you see right now is, or what we saw in his first season was Archie Miller without his players playing half of his system. I mean, maybe by the end of the season, it was like 2/3 of his system. It's not something that is necessarily going to be representative of how they play the next year or the year after or the year after that. And certainly, while you saw them adopt a certain profile at Dayton, a lot of that was dictated by the talent that Archie Miller could bring in at Dayton. And that's a lower level of profile talent than you're probably going to get certainly at a Virginia, and definitely a lower profile of talent than you could get at an Indiana. And that will have an effect on the style of play, the way things happen, with Archie Miller's teams. So I just, I think people, part of the problem with the 24-hour, not just news cycle, but the 24-hour social media cycle is that everything gets overanalyzed, everything gets parsed. And if you want to make a point because you feel like, oh, this wasn't the right hire, and I still think that there's people in the IU fan base that feel that way, there's things you can point to. You can point to, oh, they run the pack line defense. Oh, so does Virginia. Not understanding the offensive pace issues being the thing that matter the most there in terms of the differences between those two teams,
or the irony of Virginia being awesome,
we talked about this on the Mind Your Banners podcast the other day with Zach Osterman and Chronic Hoosier. IU shot poorly, ergo Archie Miller can't teach his teams how to shoot. And it's like, well, I mean, like, give the guy a couple of years with players that he actually brings in. Because, as we saw, there weren't tremendous shooting differences with a lot of the players. Maybe with a couple of the guards, there were differences. But, particularly among the post players, there were actually some improvements in certain areas. So to me, a lot of it is cart before the horse. It's trying to fit a preconceived notion of things or a very poorly conceived notion of things to an incomplete data set.
Yeah. You're listening to the Assembly Call. I'm Jared Morris here with Andy Bottoms and Galen Clavio. Andy, the other thing, that I hear from people who, are maybe still not fully on board with the Archie hire is, and we're going to talk about this in the next segment, but obviously I think the Indiana State and Fort Wayne losses really spooked Indiana fans and really are kind of weighing on many psyches even into the offseason in terms of feeling like our defense is never going to be able to defend the three-point line. Even though when you remove those two games from the ledger, Indiana was basically at the national average for defending the three-point line this year. But even offensively, to Galen's point, people took, Indiana's poor three-point shooting percentage, the poor free throw percentage, but especially the poor three-point shooting percentage, and look at it and say, wait a minute, doesn't Archie Miller realize that, basketball is going to the three-point shot? If we can't defend the three, if we can't make the three, aren't we playing Stone Age basketball here? And, this is another big difference between, what Archie does in a system like Tony Bennett's in particular, is Indiana takes a much higher percentage of their shots from 3-point range than, say, Virginia does. Now, the problem this year and with some of his Dayton teams is they didn't make a great percentage. And that's where a team like Virginia, they're extremely efficient with the threes that they take. So to Galen's point, if he can get some players in there, get some better shooters in, it feels to me like his system is actually set up to take advantage of the trend of where college basketball is going once he has the right players to run it. And obviously he'll have to make adjustments as he goes, but to me, that narrative that I've seen and heard doesn't really hold up under closer inspection of the actual games and remembering the good looks that Indiana got, and also just the numbers when you look at them.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can watch the tournament and see teams just get hot from there, and you can watch just as many teams miss wide open threes as you can, make them. So, I think we saw as IU got better with defensive rotations and handling ball screens and things like that over the course of the season, that they got better at being able to close out and run teams off the 3-point line a little bit. Whereas in the beginning of the season, it was just a parade of open shots out there. So I think that, became, again, we kind of talk about things that improved over the course of the season. I think that was one of them, and the ability to do that. It was a lot of installing the philosophy. So for me, the jury's still out on that to a certain extent as you look through. But, even if you just look in Big Ten play and you kind of take that as, all right, well, let's see, did they really improve on that over the course of the season? I mean, there was a time when opponents were shooting well over 40%, and they ended up in Big Ten play at 35.5 opponents shooting 3-pointers. So I think that speaks a little bit to the improvement that took place over time. And again, I think it some of the numbers that you talked about and the comparisons to other teams who play the same defense, there's some nuance there in terms of what you're willing to accept and what you're not. And so again, even though they're playing the same defensive system, those numbers are a little bit different just in terms of percent of attempts from the opponent takes from beyond the arc in two different teams that run the same thing. So I think to say that you're trying to force teams to shoot threes is not necessarily the case, but I think you're giving up some of those open looks. But if you can run teams off the 3-point line and maybe force them into less efficient shots like long twos or things like that, then there's some benefit to being able to do that as well.
And let me jump in and also say this: any team is susceptible to a lot of 3-pointers being hit by their opponent. Certainly there are things you can do to somewhat mitigate that, but I don't think that is a particularly endemic to the system sort of thing. It's not like the pack line defense is any more or less susceptible to a barrage of 3-pointers. And some days you're going to have situations where opponents are going to hit a bunch of threes and you're going to have problems as a result of it. If you're playing the defense right, I think it's a lot less likely. And, we saw that even, going back to the first couple of years under Tony Bennett at Virginia, a lot of bad closeouts, a lot of situations where guys were being left open on the perimeter, and that did lead to more 3-point shots being attempted. And there's a certain night where those are going to go in as opposed to other nights where they're not. But I'd say this defensive system is no worse than any of the others in terms of that particular aspect. And in certain ways, it can actually be better because even if you are getting some threes hit, ideally you're cutting down on the higher percentage shots that are being taken closer to the rim.
Exactly. And that, I think we mentioned that, but that in that Virginia game, that's what wasn't happening. They got hot from 3, but then they just started getting all kinds of dribble penetration. And now at that point, the defense wasn't taking anything away, and they just had no answer offensively. And it was the perfect storm. That's why, when I tweeted out and said, they got Indiana stated in Fort Wayne, it wasn't to compare the magnitude of the losses, but it was similar in the sense of another team just got unconscious. Virginia, like Indiana, just kind of lost their nerve a little bit, lost their focus, didn't have anything they were really doing offensively to hang their hats on that kept them in the game. And it just snowballed out of control. And that happens sometimes. Unfortunately for Virginia, it happened at, now one of the most infamous times ever. And that's something that will stick with them. But it's not something for Indiana fans to panic about because we play the same defensive system that they do. So, which I think is the main point that we wanted to make here.
Yeah, I think, and it's funny, and to go back to that Michigan State game, obviously Syracuse is not playing the pack line. They're playing, the 2-3 zone that we all know all too well. But,
Boo.
A lack of success in shooting threes doesn't prevent teams from continuing to shoot them either. So it can kind of snowball one way, but it also goes both ways. If you're able to defend that well, it doesn't necessarily discourage people from taking them, as Michigan State showed over and over and over again,
or North Carolina
in that game. Or yeah, exactly. So I think that's the other thing is that even if we have been burned so much by the opposite direction of like, man, this team just continues to shoot them and gets hot. You can also get teams into, if those are shots you're willing to give and they're not falling and you're doing a good job of contesting those, like that can be an asset as well. So just to say a team takes a lot of them isn't necessarily a bad thing, because teams will continue to take them even when they're not making them to begin with.
All right. I think we made our point here. Do you guys have any other final statements you want to make on this before we go on to the next topic?
No, I'm good.
Again, I'll just say, I just think people need to calm down a little bit. I mean, transition years are tough. Transition years are tough on both sides of the ball. And, particularly when you've got a complete sea change of approach to the game of basketball being instilled by the new coaching staff. It's a tough transition. And I think you see it. We could rattle down the list of coaches that have come in and tried to put complete changes in places. Jay Wright was in the NIT the first 3 years he was at Villanova. I mean, that's just one of many examples. Tony Bennett was the same thing at Virginia. Look, IU fans don't want to hear that. They after the inconsistencies of the Crean era, they wanted something solid, I think, immediately. And I get that, but we don't always get what we want. A lot of times that we get what we need. And I think what was needed was a transition year like we had this year in order to get things moving in the right direction.
Well, and I think the other thing is to assume, and Galen touched on this earlier, to assume that Archie Miller isn't going to tweak what he's doing based on the personnel he has and the kinds of teams that he can get, I think is, I certainly hope is doing him a disservice as a coach. Because if we look back in 3 years and say, look, he was too rigid and never was flexible enough to tweak what he did, it doesn't mean he's going to go play zone all of a sudden. It doesn't mean he's going to, completely reinvent the offense. But if you look back in a certain number of years and say, look, he didn't ever adapt it to the kinds of personnel that he could get, then yeah, that's a legitimate criticism. But we're not there yet. We're not even close to being there yet. And so to think that the incarnation of what he wants to do looks exactly like what we saw last year is foolish and gives him very little credit as being a good basketball coach.
Bingo. All right. Coming up, I want to kind of put a bow on this discussion of the pack line and talk about the myth that the pack line defense actually isn't good against three-pointers, because the data doesn't back that up. That and more coming up next. All right. 15:35 for that one. Good job, gentlemen. I think we navigated that well. I hope. We've got about 20 minutes and 30 seconds left. So I'll go through this quickly. I don't want to belabor this too much, but I do just want to make the point that pack line's actually pretty good against three-pointers when you play it correctly, just so people don't panic about that.
And I don't know if I screwed us up or whatever, but I do think we need to drive home again this idea that the problem with Virginia is the offense. It's not the defense. I mean, it's
well, and let's hit that, because after we do this, I do want to talk about this idea of, based on what we know of Archie, is that a formula that can work in the regular season and tournament? And I think maybe we bring Virginia back in to frame that. And I think that'll help, because I think there's actually a really interesting comparison with Villanova and the change that basically the pace change that they made, because they went from like these last 5 years, they've been elite, and the 6 years prior, their pace was a lot faster. And now they've dropped back to a pace of like an average of about 210. Which is well slower than they were playing, but they've been so elite, from an efficiency standpoint. But I think people think Villanova and they think fast pace, but that's not really the case. They play about as fast as Indiana played this year. So maybe we can pull that back in there.
Okay, that works for me.
I think that'll be a good spot. Okay, Andy, if I don't get out of this quickly enough, just interrupt me at a point.
Okay.
But I'm going to try not to belabor it too much. Let me just review this real quick.
Who was the fourth Final Four team last year? Gonzaga, UNC, Oregon, and who?
Oh man, Oregon.
It was somebody else relatively unexpected, wasn't it?
South Carolina. Sorry.
Oh yeah, South Carolina.
All right. See, well, I was right. I couldn't remember who it was.
You were absolutely correct.
Yep. Still unexpected. Still sounds weird to even say. So unexpected that I forgot already.
I'm collecting tempo statistics for you on this.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do this. And we'll see. This segment can take us 12, 13 minutes if we want to go that long. Because we don't have a ton for the fourth segment. Okay. Here we go. Okay. You are listening to the Assembly Call. Go to assemblycall.com/join right now to learn how to subscribe to our email newsletter. If you want to get more out of being an IU basketball fan, then you need to be on our newsletter list. You will get our weekly 6-Banner Sunday news roundups all throughout the offseason to keep you up to date on everything going on with your Indiana basketball Hoosiers. And then once the season starts again, you'll get our post-game analysis emails sent the morning after every game, content that only goes out to our email subscribers. It is all free, and it will make you a smarter IU basketball fan. Again, the URL is assemblycall.com/join. I am Jared Morris. I'm here with Andy Bottoms and Galen Clavio. And we're kind of busting some myths here a little bit. We just talked about why Archie Miller's system is not the same as Tony Bennett's system, even though they play the same defensively. And I want to just quickly bust this myth that the pack line defense is not good at defending the three-point line. And this, again, is where I feel like some of our thinking is anchored to that Indiana State and that Fort Wayne loss, where we just saw 3 after 3 after 3, and we saw a team that was so bad at running the pack line defense. I mean, it almost shouldn't really be called the pack line defense. And I think people kind of attributed the three-point shooting to that, and then you see some other anecdotal evidence, like that Virginia game against UMBC, and you start to think, wait a minute, this new defense, are we, not on the cutting edge of basketball here because we can't defend the three? But the data just doesn't back up that the pack line isn't good at defending the three. We know that in general, the pack line defense, wants to funnel the offense away from the basket. You want to stop the dribble penetration. And so teams are, if you're playing it right, are going to be shooting more outside shots, hopefully settling for shots that aren't that good, that are contested. This is what the good teams that have been running the pack line for a while, Virginia and Arizona, do. They all went through their ups and downs, struggled with it early, just like Indiana did. But now when you look at those programs that are mature running the defense, take Virginia as an example. They give up a lot of three-point attempts. They're actually 201st or worse in 6 out of the last 7 seasons. But they hold opponents to a very low percentage. And what that suggests is that for Virginia playing the defense, they are very good at closing out, at creating contested and maybe rushed looks from three-point range. So even though opponents are taking a lot, they're not making a high percentage. They're very efficient at defending those looks. Arizona, on the other hand, playing the pack line as well, but a little bit different. And they have different personnel, so you would expect some differences here. They are actually very good at reducing three-point attempts, as they've been 115th or better in the country 7 out of the last 9 seasons, and never below average in that stat. And look, one of the best ways to keep teams from hitting threes on you is just to not allow them to hit them. But they are also good at holding opponents to a low percentage. So they've got both of them covered. Now, when you look at Archie and how his teams have run it, going back to Dayton and obviously his 1 year at Indiana, so far they've kind of been average at reducing three-point attempts and somewhat consistent at holding opponents to a low percentage, kind of right about the national average. But to give you some context, if you look at this past season, and you remove Indiana State's 17 for 26 and Fort Wayne's 17 for 30, Indiana's season three-point defense goes from 36.7%, which was 267th in the country, to 34.4%, which was 131st. Now, again, you don't take those games out. They happened, but it does kind of give you a little bit of an idea when you remove some anomalous performances and factor in more of the more mature pack line they were playing toward the end of the year. It wasn't as bad as maybe our memory was tinged by those games. So I just wanted to take this time, just I think relax a little bit. If you're fearful that this system that we're playing isn't going to have a shooting threes or defending threes, I just don't think that what we've seen with our eyes and what we see with the data really backs that up. Now, is the pack line susceptible to a bonkers shooting night from downtown if another team gets hot? Yes, but as we addressed, pretty much any defense is susceptible to that if the team is going to get red hot on you. So that's not necessarily as much to do with the system. And once Indiana has the right personnel in and is better at actually executing it, I think you'll see nights like the Indiana State and the Fort Wayne game be much, much, much fewer and further between. Andy, anything that you want to add to that there?
No, I don't think I would add too much. I think I looked a little bit ahead on our run sheet, so I alluded to some of those things in some of my comments before. Just that there are different ways that this defense is going to manifest itself. That the core principles are might be the same, but the way teams really handle 3-point shooting can be a little bit different. And again, I think the ability to adapt and see what people are doing and tweak that defense is something that we'll probably see over the course of time. But again, I think when you take out some of those performances, you look at how IU did in the Big Ten. I don't think if you looked at it that way, you would be overly concerned about that. And again, it kind of goes back to the pace and the variance of whatever. If you get somebody on a hot shooting night and you don't have a lot of possessions over the course of the game, your ability to overcome that is lessened. And I think that really is kind of what was at issue with Virginia more than anything, again, to a certain extent. And then they just started to break down and gave up pretty much whatever UMBC wanted.
Yeah. All right. You're listening to the Assembly Call. I'm Jared Morris here with Andy Bottoms and Galen Clavio. Let's transition into another topic that I think is more generally on IU fans' minds. And that is, based on how we think Archie Miller's IU teams will play. And I say how we think because, again, we're just kind of trying to project from what he did at Dayton. Is that formula something that we project to be one that will give us regular season success and tournament success? And Galen, let me kick this over to you first. And I know, maybe this is where we want to maybe bring Virginia back into it a little bit because we might have, buried one of the points earlier that we wanted to make about them.
Yeah, look, I think that if you're going to take any lessons out of the game versus Maryland-Baltimore County as it relates to Virginia, and really this goes for a lot of the games that have led to the thought that Virginia, that their stuff just doesn't work in the tournament. Where they fall down is their offense. They're really not built to have games where they fall behind. They're not built for games where their shots stop falling. And you have to keep in mind that at Virginia, like we've taken for granted now. I know there's, we've had some people talk about how, Virginia's a paper tiger. Pat Forty went after the program.
A towering fraud, he said.
Towering fraud.
A ridiculously dumb line.
And I'm amazed by this because we just take for granted that Virginia is supposed to be a top basketball program right now. And that is just so out of the character of that program. That is an also ran program. That's being kind. When you talk about ACC schools, I mean, you're talking about a program that, yes, has had a couple of good years historically, but, that is not a top level ACC basketball program. And it's been turned into that by Tony Bennett using this system. It's not a place that traditionally gets a lot of top level recruits. It's not a place that gets a lot of really athletic basketball players who are going to be difference makers at the next level. Now, I think it's to Bennett's credit that he's managed to develop some players that are now getting shots at the next level. But, we tend to confuse, this team is on the same level from a program perspective as Duke or North Carolina with, this team is just having a lot of success. And why is that the case? And so if you look at Indiana, if you look at what Archie Miller has brought, I think it's important to understand that, the system that Miller has is an incredibly solid system. It's a great basis. I mean, he took a Dayton team that was, a very up and down program, frankly, and turned them into perennially a top 70 team in Ken Pom every year. I mean, the lowest they finished was 69th. The Indiana team he had this year was actually finished 4 spots lower than that. It finished 73rd. There's a limit to what you can do talent-wise at a school like Dayton. You're going to get a lot of gritty players who get by on effort and toughness, but don't have the high-end basketball skills in many cases that you'll see at even a mid-level Big Ten program, let alone a program like Indiana that can recruit with the best of them. So when I look at the solid principles that Archie Miller brings to the table, the emphasis on defense, the emphasis on not turning the ball over, the emphasis on, really just toughness. Those are all things that when we look around at other successful Big Ten programs over the course of the last 20 years, let's say, whether it's Michigan State or whether it's Wisconsin, those are the same foundational elements that those programs have. And, where I think IU can compete with the profile of a Michigan State over the last 20 years, or compete, maybe even, probably exceed what Wisconsin's been able to do, it's that IU really does have the ability to tap into the sort of elite basketball player that takes that system and elevates it to a top level. Yeah,
which obviously is going to help in NCAA tournament games and one and done type situations. I mean, that's the other thing with Virginia. You mentioned they don't get much talent. And the one guy they did have didn't even play in that first game as well. In that game against Maryland, Baltimore County, which certainly hurt them. Andy, when you look at kind of what you project forward for Archie, I mean, do you have any misgivings about, Archie being a coach that is maybe going to get Indiana to having some solid regular seasons, but then we're going to be, consistently flaming out early in the NCAA tournament?
I mean, I don't think there's anything, again, what you've seen from him at other places is relevant and directionally gives some idea of what he would be at IU. I just think we don't know what he's gonna be at IU, and I don't mean that as I don't think he's going to be good. I clearly think he do. I think he will. I think anybody who's listened to us would, certainly find that we've all been supportive of what he's doing. I just think to draw that conclusion from another team that plays in, a different way, that has been wildly successful over the course of the last 5 seasons is, just feels like you're connecting dots that aren't really there. And so to me, I don't have any concern about it, because with what we've seen from him at IU, there's no reason to have concern. If you see over the course of time that, he's getting the talent, they're not doing anything with it, the roster construction is strange and doesn't line up with what he wants to do, and he's having to constantly change how he wants to play in order to fit those pieces, then I think there's reason to be concerned. But I think to be concerned now is to not really give him a chance to see what it's going to be in the first place.
One other point I wanted to make too is about pace, because a lot of this, it seems to me that people are starting to think, you've got to play at a fast pace to win in March. And one case study on this that I think is really interesting is Villanova, which has obviously become one of the best programs in the country over the last 5 years. I mean, over those 5 seasons, they've lost 23 games. That's it. Over 5 seasons, they've lost 23 games. They've won 4 conference titles, a national title. They made the Sweet 16 this year. They also lost in the round of 32 3 times. So even as well regarded as they are, they've had some struggles in the tournament themselves. And they've been 21st or better in offense every season and top 20 in defense as well. And what's interesting is their average tempo over the last 5 seasons, the ranking of that tempo has been 211th in the country. So it's slower than the national average. And in the 6 seasons prior to their elite 5-year run, their tempo ranking was 80th. So it was faster than the national average. So they've actually slowed things down. And in doing that, it kind of in conjunction with that, their turnover rate has improved. So they're valuing possessions more, and they've added elite shooting to the mix. So they've become one of the best teams in terms of effective field goal percentage, 3-point percentage, but playing a slower pace. But I think we have this image of Villanova as this offensive juggernaut. They must play fast. You don't necessarily have to play at a breakneck pace to be a great offense and to be a varied offense. And even Virginia, we know they can be a little reliant on the 3, and maybe that's part of the reason why they've had some ups and downs in the tournament. But I think any Indiana fan would take what Virginia's had over the last 5 years. They've been tremendous. And I make that point simply because Archie's average tempo is 205th. And so they're right there. So I think to draw any conclusions that what Archie's doing, from a pace, from a tempo, from a stylistic standpoint offensively, won't be varied enough to make a deep run in March when you get hot, which is what you have to do, and just to also be consistent in the regular season and keep giving yourself the chance to knock on the door. I just don't think there's anything to back that up based on what we've seen so far.
Jared, let me throw a couple numbers at you. So you go back to that 2015 season where you had Kentucky and Wisconsin and Duke and Michigan State in the Final Four. We all know Wisconsin plays a glacial tempo. They 345th that year. Kentucky was 274th, and that team almost went undefeated. Duke wins the title. They played their tempo was 104. You mentioned Villanova, 274 in tempo. Last year, Oregon got to the Final Four with a tempo of 234. I mean, certainly I think, if you look at North Carolina, if you look at Gonzaga, they were in the top 100 in tempo. To me, like, we can get too caught up in this, and I think we get too caught up in looking at Virginia as the archetype of the slow team that can't win the big one. People said the same thing about Wisconsin until they got to the national title game. What was important for Wisconsin wasn't the pace they played. It was having great basketball players on the floor. It was having Frank Kaminsky on the floor. That's the important thing. And for IU, and I think for Virginia too, since we keep bringing them up in this, you've got to recruit game-changing athletes. You've got to recruit guys who can score, who have game that carries up to the next level. That's far more important to me than pace or even necessarily style of play. Yep.
Andy, anything else that you want to add to this before we hop into our final segment?
No, I'm ready to talk about something else.
That's okay. That's a great way to end it. Cool. Coming up in our final segment here of the Assembly Call, we've got a couple of good questions that you submitted, and so we will knock those out and, at Andy's behest, talk about anything else than what we've been talking about. What's next? I mean, you're right, Andy. I mean, obviously, I think we're all ready to put this conversation to bed. But hey, it's the off season.
It is.
We got to find good topics to chew on each week. This was the best one from this week.
No, it was a fair one to address for sure.
We have, let's see, 5 minutes and about 12 seconds. So we need to start the outro at about 4:35. I'll give a signal if one of you guys are talking and need to wrap it up quickly.
Okay.
So we'll skip this first question. We'll just go with Alex's question, because I think this can probably take us 4 minutes or so. Do you want a moment to think about this? Did you see the question?
I did see it. I still don't know that I have a great answer.
Maybe I'll do this by kicking you a question, Galen, and giving you an opportunity to make a prediction about Tom Izzo.
Oh boy.
that escalated quickly.
Yeah. It's one of the lingering issues that's going to define the trajectory of the Big Ten over the next few seasons.
No, it's the truth.
Let's see. Okay, one or two big predictions for IUBB or NCAA basketball. It's a really good question. So we'll kick it off with that, and then we'll just go back and forth.
All right, that's fine.
Okay. All right, here we go. You are listening to the Assembly Call. I am Jared Morris here with Andy Bottoms and Galen Clavio, and we are wrapping up another week of talking Indiana basketball. And so we've got a really good question here. We've got a few minutes left. We got a really good question from Alex France that we want to dive into and chew on a little bit here. And Alex's question is, if you had to make one or two big predictions for the offseason for Indiana basketball or NCAA basketball as a whole, what would they be? Another avenue for this, maybe things that you think should happen but probably won't. So let me steer this in a particular direction to kick us off, Galen. And I want to kick this over to you just based on some comments that I've seen come through your Twitter feed, which is always a good follow during college basketball season and especially the NCAA tournament. But Tom Izzo, I remember a few years back, you had a tweet about Tom Izzo losing his fastball. I think it was maybe after the loss to Middle Tennessee State. And certainly with what they did this season, and falling short of some expectations, especially in the tournament, I'm wondering, given that and all the controversy, do you think Tom Izzo will be on the Michigan State sidelines next year? And if so, how much longer is he going to be there?
I've gone back and forth on this a couple of times. A month ago, I was pretty convinced he was gone. He carried himself like a guy who just didn't want to be up on the podium. That's changed a little bit, and I think what's happened with Sean Miller in Arizona over the course of the last month has changed the tenor of this NCAA/FBI investigation. So I think Izzo will be on the sidelines starting next year, and I see him there for probably a couple more years. I think he's getting at the tail end of where he's going to want to do this on a day-to-day basis. The guy's already 63 years old. And I do think that we see this with a lot of coaches. They get to a point where they're just not quite as innovative or not quite as motivational as they were, in their prime. And yeah, Michigan State was in the Final Four just a few years ago, so it's not like we're shoveling dirt completely on the grave. But what we're seeing right now, I think, not just with the FBI situation or the sexual assault situation at Michigan State, but just the sea change that's starting to take place elsewhere in the Big Ten. You're starting to see an influx of other coaches, I think, who are going to raise the level of recruiting intensity, whether it's certainly Archie Miller at IU, whether it's Chris Holtmann at Ohio State. I think that's going to start to put pressure on some of the talent reservoirs that Michigan State has basically fished in unmolested for the last decade or so. So
get out of Indiana, Izzo. Get out.
Yeah, get out of Central Indiana. Get out of Northern Indiana. We'll give you Angola and maybe Granger, and that's about it. Yeah. But I think that's going to start changing the tides a little bit as far as Michigan. There's still a Nike program. There's still like a top level program. They're going to get recruits nationally, but I only see him on the sidelines for a couple more years.
Andy, do you have any predictions that you would like to offer up
on Izzo or anything else?
No, I mean Izzo, sure, but anything.
I mean, the Izzo thing is interesting. I think there are a number of people who benefited from the UMBC win over Virginia. Chief among them was Tom Izzo and Sean Miller at Arizona, who, if not for that, if you look back at, we had these conversations about seeding Michigan State over the course of the season, and the reality was, it seems like they should be better than they are. Even though they won the Big Ten regular season, the unbalanced schedule and all that stuff. But when you look back on it, they beat 2 tournament teams heading into the tournament itself. And they had let a lot of inferior teams hang around with them at various points during the season. And that's absolutely what happened in Syracuse. I think they just kind of got to a point where they felt like they could turn it on. And so I think there's definitely a component of, one of the more disappointing performances from an Izzo coach team based on the talent that was on the roster and the expectations heading into the season. That being said, I don't necessarily know that he's going anywhere. He certainly seems to be willing to ride it out and kind of see what happens in that regard. But, I think you certainly will see some coaching changes as a result of everything that's happened with the FBI. I just don't, he obviously has a slightly different issue, and whether there's, ties to that remains to be seen. But I don't think he'll be changing, but I do think you'll see a couple other high-profile openings open up as a result of that over the course of the offseason, maybe at a more odd timing than we might normally expect, when most of those things happen at the end of the season, and then it starts to get a little bit, get off the rails a little bit based on when they will happen.
Yep. All righty. Well, that will do it for us on this week's episode of the Assembly Call. If you want to see us do the show live and be part of the live chat, join us at assemblycall.com on Thursday nights for the live broadcast of our Assembly Call radio recording. Or you can always subscribe to our podcast by searching for Assembly Call wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to go to assemblycall.com/join to join our free email newsletter. Thank you for listening. We will be back to talk IU hoops again with you next week. Until then, keep your elbows in and your eyes on the rim, and go Hoosiers. All right. See, now I feel bad because I completely hijacked Alex's question and made it about Izzo, and that's all we talked about. So if Alex is still here, so we can do this for YouTube, but maybe some predictions. I have to think they're going to do something about replay, right?
No. I mean, they should do something about replay. I just don't think they're going to have the institutional will to change. I mean, it's like the NFL can't even get the catch rule properly changed. I don't see the NCAA, which had a hard enough time installing replay, figuring out, we need to change this because it's hurting the game. I don't think they're going to grasp how to do that sort of a change without backing it out entirely, because they're so obsessed, and they're not the only ones, but they're so obsessed with having the officials on the floor have ultimate control over the calls. And that's unworkable. I mean, there's nothing they can do to change it. They're not going to be able to put timers on it or anything like that. It's still going to end up being very obtrusive. So I don't see any changes being made on that front.
Lovely.
Sorry.
I think Romeo's going to come to Indiana. I don't have any inside information on that, but
what do you think of this rumor that he's waiting to see who the new Louisville coach is?
I don't buy it.
Okay, good. I don't necessily buy it either, but
it doesn't jibe with it. It just doesn't jibe with anything, because it feels like the family's big on relationships and really kind of understanding the system and getting close and knowing what they're going to be dealing with for the year that he's there. I just don't see why, unless it's a coach that they already have a great relationship with, and I don't know who that would be, why I just can't see that at all. So,
yeah, I mean, Chris Mack's the name that's getting thrown out. Like, I don't know that there's been any real meaningful contact there with, they've talked about that over the year. I want to see, what they do systematically and how they might use him and whatever else. Like, I don't know how you'd be able to do that.
Yeah. It's college basketball it's fascinating because I think everybody wants change of some sort in the sport. And yet I don't know if anything is going to really change here over the course of the next year, including with this FBI thing. Like the further along this goes, the more it feels like there's not going to be this sort of like abrupt seismic shifts that a lot of people thought there were going to be. If there was, I think we would have seen it already. I think we would have seen some bombs dropped at the beginning of the NCAA tournament. We saw basically none of that. Like the biggest thing was the Cal State Northridge thing with Mark Gottfried, and even that ended up being nothing. So I kind of wonder if the fire's gone out on that a little bit.
It sure seems like it. The momentum's definitely died down. So unless they're holding back stuff, but I don't know. I was hopeful that it would cause some kind of change, but now I wonder. What do you think about if the NBA gets rid of the one and done? Are you in favor of that?
Me or Andy?
Either one.
Andy, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was asking if you wanted to take it first.
Oh, I mean, I don't really have an issue with it. I don't think, like it or not, college basketball is not something that people are as into as the three of us probably would be. And so is the lack of having those players, I guess I don't, there aren't a lot of casual fans who come and really embrace what's going on in college basketball until the tournament. So is not having those guys going to change that? I would argue it's not. And I don't know that it's going to hurt the overall product. So to me, it doesn't matter. That's up to the players. Everybody will look back and say, this guy made a bad decision. This guy should have done something differently. But you could do that today with guys that go pro after 1 year or 2 years or whatever. And I don't really understand, to me, people are going to make bad decisions no matter what you do because they're listening to the wrong people or they're doing whatever. So, to prop up what is in place now is some type of, helping the greater good of saving these kids from themselves and the decisions they would make is pretty stupid.
I mean, here's the thing. I think that the NBA, they'll probably change the rule, and I don't have a problem with it. I think that it's not fair to the guys who have the ability to go pro right now that they are not allowed to. I just think if college basketball had somebody running it, and this is, I've talked about this a little bit on the Twitter feed before. If there was somebody that actually ran college basketball and had a destination for the sport in mind, like had some kind of direction that they were trying to take the sport, they'd realize that you're better off having really good players playing rather than not. It's not a bad thing to make accommodations for the very best players that are out there and figure out a way to have a system where those guys can still, carry the banner for the individual schools that they're playing for. I think that certainly it takes some changes to the model overall, but I don't know that they're only surface level changes, because it would basically just be legitimizing a system that has existed underground for, as long as college basketball has been around. I mean, it's not like we'd be throwing anything new at these guys. I think that's what people, if you read the FBI stuff closely, that's really what's been going on. It's Adidas or Nike or whoever. They're cultivating, future star basketball players at the time that they're 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, and they're sending them to a school for a year to help develop an asset that they can then draft or have drafted in the NBA and continue on to be a marketable star. I mean, let's just bring that system above ground and figure out a way where everybody can benefit, rather than this situation where we're going to be like, well, if they don't want to come to school for 3 years, we don't want them at all. It's like, that's stupid. Like, that hurts college basketball. It hurts the universities and it hurts the product overall. I think there's a way to bridge those gaps.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's fair to restrict the guys from being able to go. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. The whole charade of college athletics, I don't understand why we have to play it anymore. I mean, I realize it's complicated and all of that, but if you could bring what is below ground above ground, who does that hurt? Besides maybe the presidents or the the people who are making a lot of money right now. I mean, who is really hurt by bringing that above ground?
The big thing that people, I think, miss out on in this is that there's multiple aspects of the NCAA system that have tried to dig in. There's certainly the athletic directors and the presidents who want to keep the quid pro quo of having unpaid labor, where they're just basically pocketing straight profit. There's also a big contingent of people in athletic circles who are former scholarship athletes, generally from non-revenue sports, who, their whole deal is, this should be amateur athletics because that's what I did when I was in school, and we need to preserve this amateur model. But that doesn't really work because all the financing's coming out of the revenue generating sports. And so you've got some weird ideals clashing. You've got people that are just, hell-bent against any sort of a system where it seems like, there's money being made by athletes. It's a very weird setup, and it goes to a lot of much deeper societal issues in terms of how we view athletics in general. I mean, hell, it's a different topic, but it's tied together. There's a bill, and I think it's either in Congress or the Senate right now, that would basically exempt minor league baseball players from the Fair Labor Standards Act, where they wouldn't have to be paid for what they're actually doing. It's basically, a market where they can be paid whatever the owners want them to be paid. And, you see a lot of comments from people on Twitter about that saying, yeah, they're already getting paid too much as it is. And it's like, that's really, I think, where a lot of the public perception issue of this comes out of, is this idea that a lot of people have of athletes shouldn't be paid at all or very little for what they do. So as an academic, it's a fascinating issue because all of these things kind of crash together, and everybody just cherry picks the one aspect of the issue that they believe in and then promotes that as the primary reason why.
I look forward to your book on this topic.
I'll let you know when that comes out. It's going to be a little while.
All right. Thanks for joining us, Galen. It's always awesome having you here.
I love you guys, and I love doing it. So anytime, I really enjoy the opportunity. Thank you.
And when you can sit in the seat of the son of Zeus, I mean, who can?
I mean, hard to pass up that opportunity.
We're gonna have.
He's never gonna text me again.
The Trojan Wars coming up next, except in podcast form.
Oh man. All right. So anyway, go Texas A&M Thursday night. I have to go with my wife's Aggies over the Big Ten. Normally I would cheer for Michigan, but I got to go Aggies.
I meant to mention this on the podcast, but my Crimson Cast partner Scott is flying a Texas Tech flag.
I saw the picture of that.
And the funny thing is, like, he's got Purdue fans that are neighbors, and like Brian Cardinal lives in the next neighborhood over. So it's that sort of a thing,
Nice. Yeah. So he's had that Texas Tech banner, I'm assuming, for many years now.
I doubt it. I don't know where he got. I haven't talked to him about it yet, but he might have just actually bought it because I
thought maybe he dug that up from the night days, the Andre Emmett days. When we were all cheering for Texas Tech.
Jarius Jackson and Ronald Ross. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, gents. Well, this was fun. Thanks everybody for being here. Always awesome to have the live audience. And,
thanks everybody in the audience. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll be back next week on Thursday, our normal time.
Yep. And I will not be on Thursday. So
okay. So we'll have to find a replacement for Andy.
Tough to do, I'm sure, but
It is. It's always tough. But we'll make do. We'll make do. All right. We'll talk to you guys later.
Sounds good.
See you, everybody.
Later.